The Education of Little Tree by Forrest Carter. Down from the Mountain, page 942. Fall came early to the mountains that year. First, along the rims, high against the sky, the red and yellow leaves shook in a brisking wind. Frost had touched them. The sun turned to amber and slanted rays through the trees and into the holler. Each morning, the frost worked its way farther down the mountain. A timid frost, not killing, but letting you know that you couldn't hold on to summer no more than you could hold back time. Letting you know that winter was the winter dying was coming. Fall is nature's grace time, giving you a chance to put things in order for the dying. And so, when you put things in order, you sort out all you must do and all you have not done. It is a time for remembering and regretting and wishing you had done some things you have not done and said some things you had not said. I wish I had thanked Mr. Wine for the yeller coat. He didn't come that month. We sat on the porch in late evenings and watched the holler trail and listened, but he didn't come. Me and Grandpa determined we would go to the settlement to see about him. Frost touched the holler, light barely reminding. It turned the persimmon red and ran yellow trimmings round the edge of the poplar and maple leaves. The creatures who was to stay the winter worked harder putting up their stores so not to die. Blue jays made long lines flying back and forth to the high oaks, carrying acorns to their nests. Now they didn't play or call. Last butterfly flew up the holler. He rested on a corn stalk where me and Grandpa had stripped the corn. He didn't flex his wings, just sat and waited. Had no purpose in storing food. He's going to die, and he knew it. Grandpa said he was wiser than a lot of people. He didn't fret about it. He knew he had served his purpose, and now his purpose was to die. So he waited there in the last warmth of the sun. Me and Grandpa got in stove wood and fireplace logs. Grandpa said we had grass hoppered around all summer and now was pushed to get our winter's warm settled up, which we had. We dragged dead tree trunks and heavy limbs from the mountain side into the clearing. Grandpa's axe flashed in the evening sun and rang and echoed up the holler. I toted in the wood chips for the kitchen bin and racked the fireplace logs against the cabin side. This is what we was doing when the politicians come. They said they was not politicians, but they was. A man and a woman. They would not take the rockers offered to them, but sat straight in the high-back chairs. The man wore a gray suit and the woman wore a gray dress. The dress was choked so tight round her neck that I figured it made her look the way she did. The man held his knees together like a woman. He kept his hat on his knees and was nervous, for he continually turned the hat round and round. The woman wasn't nervous. The woman said that I ought to leave the room, but Grandpa said that I sat in on everything there was to set in on. So I stayed and sat in my little rocker and rocked. The man cleared his throat and said people was concerned about my education and such. He said that it had ought to be looked after, and Grandpa said it was. He told him what Mr. Wine said. The woman asked Grandpa who Mr. Wine was, and he told her all about Mr. Wine, though he didn't mention how Mr. Wine was always a-fretting everything. The woman sniffed her nose and brushed around at her skirts, like she figured Mr. Wine was somewheres about and fixing to get under her dress. I seen right off she total discounted Mr. Wine, which she did us too. She give Grandpa a paper, which he give to Grandma. Grandma lit the lamp and sat at the kitchen table to read the paper. She started to read it out loud, but she stopped. She read the rest of it to herself. When she finished, she stood up and leaned over and blew out the lamp. Politicians knew what this meant. I did too. They stood up in the half-light and stumbled out the door. They didn't say goodbye. We waited in the dark a long time after they left. Grandpa lit the lamp and we sat at the kitchen table. I couldn't see what was on the paper as my head only come above the table edge, but I listened. The paper said some people had filed with the law. It said I was not being done right by. The paper said Grandma and Grandpa had no right to keep me, that they was old and had no education. It said Grandma was an Indian and Grandpa was a half-breed. Grandpa, it said, had a bad reputation. The paper said Grandma and Grandpa was selfish, and being that way was totally hampering me for the rest of my continual life. They was selfish, it said, because they just wanted comfort in their old age and was putting me out more or less to give it to them. The paper had things to say about me, but Grandma would not read it out loud. It said that Grandpa and Grandpa had so many days in which they could come in court and give answer to it. It said otherwise I was to be put in an orphanage. Grandpa was total stumped. He'd taken off his hat and laid it on the table, and his hand shook. He rubbed his hat with his hand and just sat looking at the hat and rubbing it. I went and sat in my rocker by the fireplace and rocked. I told Grandma and Grandpa that I figured I could up my dictionary learning to practical 10 words a week. I told them that more than likely I could up it even more, maybe to 100. I was learning to read, and I told them I seen right off that I was going to have to double up on my reading, and I reminded them what Mr. Wine had said about my figuring, which, even though he didn't count none with the politicians, it still showed I was moving ahead. I couldn't stop talking. I tried to stop, but I couldn't. I rocked harder and harder, talked faster and faster. Told Grandpa I was in no wise hampered at all, that I figured I was getting the uppers on just about everything. Grandpa would not answer me. Grandma held the paper and stared at it. I seen they figured they was what the paper said they was. I said they wasn't. I said it was the other way around, and that they comforted me, and I was more than likely about the worst thing that had come along for him to have to mind about. I told Grandpa I had burdened them up pretty heavy, and they had not in no wise burdened me. I told them I stood ready to tell the law this very thing, but they wouldn't talk. I said I was getting ahead otherwise too, learning a trade and all. I told Grandpa that I was total certain no other young'un my age was learning a trade. Grandpa looked at me for the first time. His eyes was dull. He said maybe the law being like they was, that we ought not to mention about the trade. I went to the table and sat on Grandpa's leg. I told him and Grandma I would not go with the law. I said I would go back in the mountains and stay with Willa John until such times as the law forgot about the whole thing. I asked Grandma what an orphanage was, and Grandma looked at me across the table. Her eyes didn't look right either. Grandma said an orphanage was where they kept young'uns who didn't have a pa and ma. She said there was lots of young'uns there. She said the law would come looking if you went back and stayed with Willa John. I seen right off that the law might find our still if they'd taken to looking. I didn't mention Willa John again. And Grandpa said we would go to the settlement in the morning and see Mr. Wine. We left at daybreak down the holler trail. Grandpa had the paper to show Mr. Wine. Grandpa knew where he lived, and when we got to the settlement, he turned down a side street. Mr. Wine lived over a feed store. We went up long ladder steps that wobbled as we climbed up the side of the feed store. The door was locked, and Grandpa shook it and knocked on it, but nobody answered. Excuse me. There's dust over the glass, and Grandpa wiped it away and looked in. He said there wasn't anything in there. We walked slowly down the steps. I followed Grandpa around to the front of the feed store, and we went in. Coming out of the noontime sun, it was dark in the store. Me and Grandpa stood for a minute to get our sight. A man was leaning against the counter. "Howdy," he said. "What for you?" His stomach hung over the belt of his breeches. "Howdy," Grandpa said. "We was looking for Mr. Wine, the feller which lives over your store." "Mr. Wine ain't his name," the man said. He had a toothpick in his mouth which he worked from side to side. He sucked on the toothpick and taking it out and frowned at it like it tasted bad. "In fact," he said, "he ain't got no name no more. He's dead." Me and Grandpa was stumped. We didn't say anything. I felt hollow inside. My knees weaked. I had built up a pretty heavy dependence on Mr. Wine as handling our situation. I figured Grandpa had counted heavy on it too, for he didn't know what to do next. "Your name be Wales?" the fat man asked. "It be," Grandpa said. The fat man walked behind the counter, reached under it, and dragged out a tow sack. He swung it up on the counter. It was full of something. "The old man left this here for ye," he said. "See, the tag got your name on it." Grandpa looked at the tag, though he couldn't read it. He had everything tagged. The fat man said he knew he was going to die. He even had a tag tied around his wrist, telling where to ship the body. He knew exactly how much it cost, too. Left the money in an envelope, right down to the penny. Stingy. No money left over, just like a damn Jew. Grandpa looked up hard from under his hat. Paid his obligations, didn't he? The fat man got serious. "Oh, yes, I had nothing against the old man. Didn't know him. Nobody much did. Spent all his time wandering around the mountains." Grandpa swung the tow sack over his shoulder. "Could ye direct me to a lawyerin' man?" The fat man pointed across the street, right in front of you, up the stairs, between them buildings. "Thank ye," Grandpa said. We walked to the door. "Funny thing," the fat man said after us. "The old Jew, when we found him, the only thing he hadn't tagged was a candle. The darn fool had it lit and burning right beside him. I knew about the candle, but I didn't say nothing. I knew about the money, too. Mr. Wine was not stingy. He was thrifty and paid his obligations and seen that his money was used in the right manner." We went across the street and up the steps. Grandpa toted the sack. Grandpa knocked on the door that had glass across the top, lettering on it. Come in, the voice sounded. Like he wasn't supposed to knock. We went in. A man was leaning back in a chair behind the desk. He had white hair and looked old. When he saw me and Grandpa, he got up slow. Grandpa taken off his hat and set down the tow sack. The man leaned over his desk and stuck out his hand. "My name is Taylor," he said. "Joe Taylor." "Wales," Grandpa said. Grandpa taken his hand but didn't shake it. He turned loose of it and handed Mr. Taylor our paper. Mr. Taylor sat down and taking eyeglasses out of a vest pocket. He leaned on the desk and read the paper. I watched him. He frowned. He looked at the paper for a long time. When he finished, he folded the paper slow and handed it back to Grandpa. He looked up. "You been in jail? Whiskey making?" "Once," Grandpa said. Mr. Taylor got up and walked to a big window. He looked down in the street a long time. He sighed and didn't look at Grandpa. "I could take your money, but it wouldn't do no good. Government bureaucrats that run these things don't understand mountain people. Don't want to. I don't think the sons of bitches understand anything." He was looking a long way off at something out the window. He coughed. "Nor Indians. We'd lose. They'll take the boy." Grandpa put on his hat. He'd taken his purse from his forward pants pocket and unsnapped and felt around. He laid $1 on Mr. Taylor's desk. We left. Mr. Taylor was still looking out the window. We walked out of the settlement, Grandpa leading, toting the tow sack. Mr. Wine was gone. I knew we had lost. It was the first time I could keep up easy with Grandpa. He walked slow, his moccasins dragged in the dirt. I figured he was tired. He was on the hollow trail when I asked him, "Grandpa, what is a damn Jew?" Grandpa stopped and didn't look back at me. His voice sounded tired, too. "I don't know. Something is said about him in the Bible somewheres or others. Must go back a long ways." Grandpa turned around. "Like the Indian. I hear tell they ain't got no nation neither." Grandpa looked down at me. His eyes looked like Willa John's. Grandpa lit the lamp. We opened the tow sack. There on the kitchen table, there was rolls of red cloth and green and yellow cloth for Grandma, needles, thimbles, and spools of thread. I told Grandpa it looked like Mr. Wine had might near emptied his pack into the tow sack. She said it looked that way to her. There was all manner of tools for Grandpa and books. A figuring book and a little black book that Grandma said had valuing sayings in it for me. There was a book with pictures of boys and girls and dogs. It had writing in it and was brand new, for it still shined. I figured Mr. Wine was going to bring it on his next trip if he didn't forget. That was all, we thought. Grandpa picked up the empty sack and started to put it on the floor. Something bumped in the sack, and Grandpa turned it up. A red apple rolled out on the table. It was the first time that Mr. Wine had recollected the apple. Something else rolled out, and Grandma picked it up. It was a candle, and it had one of Mr. Wine's tags on it. Grandpa read it. It said, Willa John. We didn't eat much supper. Grandpa told about our trip to the settlement, about Mr. Wine and what Mr. Taylor had said. Grandma blew out the lamp, and we sat by the fireplace in the half-dark of a new moon coming through the window. We didn't light a fire. I rocked. I told Grandpa and Grandpa they was not to feel bad about it. I said I didn't. More than likely I would like the orphanage, which all the young'uns and such being there. I said it would not take long to satisfy the law, more than likely, and I could come back. Grandma said we had 3 days, and then I was to be delivered up to the law. We didn't talk anymore, and I didn't know what to say. We all three rocked, our chairs creaking, far into the night, and we didn't talk. When we went to bed for the first time since Ma died, I cried. But I put the blanket in my mouth, and Grandma and Grandpa didn't hear me. We filled up the 3 days, living hard as we could. Grandma went everywhere with me, and Grandpa up the Narrows to Hanging Gap. We taken Blue Boy and the hounds. One morning early in the dark, we taken the high trail. We sat on the top of the mountain and watched daybreak over the rims. I showed Grandpa and Grandma my secret place. Grandma spilt sugar in practically everything she cooked. Me and Grandpa eat fairly heavy on meal cookies. The day before I was to leave, I slipped off over the cut-off trail to the Crossroads store. Mr. Jenkins said the red and green box was old, and so he would sell it for 65 cents, which I paid him. I bought a box of red stick candy for Grandpa, which cost $0.25. This left me a dime out of $1 I had got from Mr. Chunk. That night, Grandpa cut my hair. He said it was necessary, for it might be hard on me looking like an Indian and all. I told Grandpa I didn't care. I said I had just as soon look like Willa John. I was not to wear my moccasin. Grandpa stretched my old shoes. He taken a piece of iron and pushed it into the shoes, punching the leather of the uppers out over the soles. My feet had growed. I told Grandma I would leave my moccasins under my bed, as I would more than likely be back pretty soon, and they'd be handy. I put my deer shirt on the bed. I told Grandma that it could stay there, as nobody would be sleeping in my bed until I come back. I hid the red and green box in Grandma's meal bin, where she'd find it in a day or two, and put the box of stick candy in Grandpa's suit coat. He'd find it on Sunday. I had only taken out one piece, more or less, to prove it out, and it was good. Grandpa would not go to the settlement for the leave, and Grandpa waited in the clearing for me. And Grandma knelt down on the porch and held me like she held Willa John. I held her too. I tried not to cry, but I did some. I had on my old shoes, which if I stretched my toes, they didn't hurt. I wore my best overalls and my white shirt. I wore the yellow coat. In my toe sack, Grandma had put 2 more shirts and my other pair of overalls and my socks. I would not carry anything else, for I knew I would be back. I told Grandma I would. Kneeling there on the porch, Grandma said, "Do you recollect the Dog Star little tree? The one we look at in the dusk of evening?" I said I did, and Grandma said, "Wherever you are, no matter where, in the dusk of the evening, you look at the Dog Star. Me and Grandpa will be looking too. We'll remember." I told her I'd remember too, and it was like Mr. Wine and his candle. I asked Grandma to tell Willa John to look at the Dog Star too, which she said she would. Grandma held me by the shoulders and looked at me. She said, "The Cherokees married your pa and ma. Will you remember that little tree, no matter what is said? Remember." Excuse me. I said I would. Grandma turned me loose. I picked up my toe sack and followed Grandpa out of the clearing. Across the footlog, I looked back. Grandma was standing on the porch watching. She raised her hand and touched her heart and pushed a hand after me. I knew what she meant. Grandpa had on his black suit. He had his shoes on too, and we both kind of clumped along. Down the hollow trail, pine branches swept low and held my arms. An oak limb reached out fingers and pulled the toe sack off my shoulder. A persimmon bush grabbed my legs. The spring branch commenced to run harder and jump and fuss, and a crow flew down across us and called over and over, and then sat on high treetop and called and called. All them was saying, "Don't go, little tree. Don't go, little tree." I knew what they was saying, and so my eyes blinded, and I stumbled along behind Grandpa. The wind rose and moaned and picked at the tail of my yellow coat. The iron briars reached over the trail path and hung themselves on my legs. A mourning dove called, long and lonesome, and was not answered. So I knew she was calling for me. Me and Grandpa had a hard time making it down the holler trail. We waited on the bus station. Me and Grandpa sitting on a bench. I held my toe sack in my lap. We was waiting for the law. I told Grandpa I didn't hardly see how he was going to make it in the whiskey trade, me not being there to help. Grandpa said it'd be hard. He'd have to double up on his work time. I told Grandpa that more than likely I would be back pretty quick and he wouldn't have to double up long. Grandpa said more than likely I would. We didn't say much else. The clock ticked on the wall. I could tell the time, and I told Grandpa. There wasn't many people in the bus station, a woman and a man. Times being hard, Grandpa said folks wasn't traveling by paying ways, which they wasn't. I told Grandpa I reckon if the mountains run down as far as the orphanage. Grandpa said he didn't know. He'd not been there. We waited some more. The woman came in. I knew her. It was the woman in the gray dress. She come up and me and Grandpa, and when Grandpa stood up, she handed him some papers. Grandpa put them in his pocket, and she said the bus was waiting. She said, "We don't want any fuss now. Let's get on with it. What has to be done has to be done, best for everybody," which I didn't know what she was talking about, and Grandpa didn't either. She was all business. She'd taken a string out of her purse and tied it around my neck. I had a tag. It had a tag on it, like one of Mr. Wine's tags. The tag had writing on it. Me and Grandpa followed her out the back of the bus station to the bus. I had my toe sack thrown over my shoulder, and Grandpa knelt there by the open door of the bus and held me like he held Willa John. He held me a long time, kneeling on the pavement with both his knees. I whispered to Grandpa. I said, "I'll more than likely be back directly." Grandpa squeezed me that he heard. The woman said, "You'll have to go now." I didn't know whether she's talking to me or Grandpa. Grandpa stood up and he turned and walked off, and he didn't look back. The woman picked me up and set me on the step of the bus, which I could have made it myself. She told the bus driver to read my tag, and so I stood for him while he read it. I told the bus driver I didn't have a ticket and wasn't right sure about riding as I didn't have any money. He laughed and said the woman had give him my ticket. There wasn't but 3 people on the bus. I went back and sat down by a window where maybe I could see Grandpa. The bus started up and moved out of the station. I saw the woman with the gray dress watching. We moved down the street, and I couldn't find Grandpa anywhere. Then I saw him. He's standing on the corner of the street by the bus station. He had his hat pulled down low, and his hands hung down by his sides. We went by him, and I tried to raise the window, but I didn't know how. I waved, but he didn't see me. As the bus passed on, I run to the back of the bus and looked out the back window. Grandpa was still there watching the bus. I waved and hollered, "Goodbye, Grandpa. I'll be back more than likely pretty quick." He didn't see me. I hollered some more. "I'll more than likely be directly back, Grandpa," but he just stood getting smaller and smaller in the late evening sun. His shoulders sloped. Grandpa looked old. End of chapter.